The valley was burning. Not literally, not yet. But the sky above it flickered like someone had lit 1,000 matches in the dark, trace of fire streaking upward in glowing arcs that painted the night in shades of amber and red. On the ground, somewhere below the ridgeline, a mechanized column was grinding forward through the dust. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, all moving in a coordinated push that had the kind of momentum you don't stop with wishes or bravery alone. The numbers were ugly. Dozens of armored vehicles, maybe more, rolling hard toward a small U.S. outpost that had been holding ground for weeks but was now staring down the barrel of something far too big for its handful of defenders to handle. The clock was ticking. Less than 15 minutes until the column breached the outer perimeter. Less than 15 minutes until the fight turned from difficult to catastrophic. On the radio, the voices of the ground troops had that particular edge to them, the kind that comes when training and discipline are still holding, but only just. You could hear it in the clipped words, the pauses that lasted a heartbeat too long, the way requests for air support had started to sound less like tactical calls and more like prayers. They needed help. They needed it now. And the problem was, most of the friendly air assets were too far out to make it in time. Apaches, fast movers, close air support, all of it was either engaged elsewhere or still spooling up on distant airfields, too many miles away to matter in the next 14 minutes. The math was brutal and simple. The column would arrive before the cavalry did. In the background of the radio traffic, you could hear command weighing options. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the low, tense murmur of senior officers running through a playbook that didn't have any good answers. Evacuate and abandon the outpost. Brace for overrun and hope the defenses hold long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Someone mentioned artillery, but the fire missions were already stacked deep, and even if they could redirect, it wouldn't be enough to stop that much armor. The conversation had the rhythm of people trying to solve a problem that might not have a solution. And then, cutting through the static and the stress, another voice joined the channel. Calm, measured, almost quiet. Call sign, Raven. She was already airborne, orbiting at a distance, far enough out that the enemy column probably didn't even know she was there yet. A lone Apache, one pilot, one aircraft, watching the situation unfold from a few thousand feet and a few miles away. She'd been listening to the radio chatter, absorbing the panic, the desperation, the slow realization that the outpost was about to get overrun. And while everyone else was still debating what couldn't be done, she was already calculating what could. But command wasn't sure. You could hear it in the pause after she checked in. One of the senior officers, someone with enough rank to make decisions and enough caution to second-guess them, came back on the line with a question that wasn't really a question. More of a concern wrapped in professional language. Could she handle that kind of load on her own? Was she aware of the size of the column? Did she understand the risk of pushing in solo against that much armor, that much firepower, that much chaos? The subtext was loud even if the words were careful. This wasn't a mission for one pilot. This was a situation that required overwhelming force, coordinated strikes, multiple aircraft working in tandem. And here she was, suggesting she could do it alone. The doubt wasn't cruel. It wasn't dismissive in the way that insults are dismissive. But it was there, hanging in the air like a question mark, a quiet skepticism about whether one Apache, one pilot, could rewrite the math before the clock ran out. Raven didn't argue. She didn't defend herself or push back or waste time proving she understood the stakes. She just acknowledged the transmission, her voice still steady, still calm, and then said something that cut through all the debate and doubt and half-formed contingency plans. She was pushing in, alone, against the whole column. There was a beat of silence on the channel. The kind of silence that happens when someone says something so decisive that everyone else has to recalibrate. The ground troops were still calling for support. The enemy column was still rolling forward. The clock was still ticking. And now, instead of watching the situation spiral toward disaster, everyone was listening to one pilot make a choice that sounded either incredibly brave or incredibly reckless, depending on how the next few minutes played out. Because here's the thing about moments like this. They hinge on belief. Not the abstract kind, not the motivational poster version where belief conquers all and hope is a strategy. but the specific, grounded kind of belief that comes from knowing your aircraft, knowing your weapons, knowing your limits, and choosing to push past out because the alternative is watching people die. Raven wasn't flying into that valley because she thought she was invincible. She was flying in because she knew the stakes, knew the odds, and decided that even if the odds were bad, they were still better than doing nothing. The Apache is a terrifying machine in the right hands. A flying weapons platform built to hunt armor, to loiter over battlefields, to deliver precision strikes with Hellfire missiles and 30mm cannon fire that can shred vehicles and turn defensive positions into smoking craters. But it's not invincible. It's not a magic bullet. It's a tool, and like any tool, it's only as effective as the person using it. Against a handful of targets, an Apache is devastating. Against dozens of armored vehicles spread across a valley, moving fast, returning fire, coordinating their advance. That's a different equation. That's the kind of fight where even the best pilots can get overwhelmed, where one mistake means getting lit up by anti-aircraft fire or taking a lucky shot from a tank that sees you coming. And yet Raven was going in alone. The ground troops heard the transmission. You could almost feel the shift in their voices, a flicker of something that wasn't quite hope yet, but wasn't resignation either. Maybe disbelief. Maybe desperation. Maybe just the raw human instinct to grab onto any lifeline, even if it seems too thin to hold. They didn't know her. They didn't know her record, her training, her experience. All they knew was that someone was coming. One Apache, one pilot, against an entire mechanized column that was less than 13 minutes from rolling over their position. Command didn't count them on the decision. They could have. They probably should have. By the book. Solo attacks against overwhelming enemy forces aren't standard operating procedure. They're the kind of thing that gets dissected in after-action reports and training scenarios as examples of what not to do. But sometimes the book doesn't have an answer for the situation you're in. Sometimes the only option left is to let someone take the shot, even if the shot seems impossible, because the alternative is admitting defeat before the fight is over. So they let her go. And now the question wasn't whether Command believed she could do it. The question was whether she could actually pull it off. Could one pilot, one aircraft, hold back a column of dozens of tanks and armored vehicles long enough to save an outpost full of soldiers who were counting down the minutes until they got overrun? Could she navigate the chaos, manage the targeting, avoid the return fire, and deliver enough destruction to break the enemy's momentum before they broke through the perimeter? The valley was still burning. The column was still advancing. The clock was still ticking. And Raven was already pushing in, alone, into a fight that most people would have called suicide. You're right. Let me rewrite with proper flowing sentences. She wasn't supposed to be here, not in the Apache, not in this fight, not even in the unit if you listen to the whispers that circulated during her first months in the squadron. The Apache wasn't just a helicopter. It was a machine that had earned its reputation in blood and precision, flown by pilots who'd proven themselves in the worst conditions imaginable. And when Raven showed up to begin her transition training, there were instructors who made it quietly clear they weren't sure she belonged in that cockpit, not because of anything she'd done, but because the Apache was, in their words, too much machine for someone like her. Too much weight. Too many systems to manage while rounds are screaming up at you and targets are moving and the radio is chaos and you're trying to stay alive long enough to complete the mission. The Apache demands everything at once. Situational awareness, split-second decisions, weapons management, flight controls, defensive systems, all running simultaneously in your head while the world tries to kill you. Even experienced pilots struggle during the transition. But Raven didn't struggle. She adapted in ways that made the doubters uncomfortable, because her competence didn't fit the narrative they'd already written about her. In the ready room, some of the guys joked about quota pilots, the kind of jokes that got laughed off as harmless but carried venom underneath. The implication was always the same. She was there to check a box, not because she'd earned the seat through merit or skill. And for a while, she let them joke, let them underestimate her. Let them assume she'd wash out or get reassigned to something safer, something more appropriate for someone who supposedly couldn't handle the pressure. Then she started out flying them, not dramatically or with flash, but consistently and methodically, outperforming everyone in the simulator, on the gunnery ranges, in every evaluation that mattered. While other pilots hit acceptable scores, she hit perfect ones. While they memorized the basics, she was studying enemy armor layouts at 2 in the morning, rehearsing fuel and ammo calculations, drilling herself on doctrine until she could recite engagement protocols in her sleep. She became the pilot who was always over-prepared, the one who knew the answer before the instructor finished asking, the one who could troubleshoot a malfunction faster than pilots with twice her flight hours. The jokes stopped, but the whispers didn't, because proving yourself once doesn't erase doubt. It just moves the goalposts. Now the question wasn't whether she could fly the Apache, because clearly she could, but whether she could handle it under real pressure, in real combat, when the stakes were measured in lives and the margin for error was non-existent. Could she manage both flying and weapons systems simultaneously when rounds were coming up and targets were moving and friendly troops were dying? Could she make the calls, take the risks, deliver the violence that the mission required? Right now, in the cockpit, she was doing exactly that, flipping switches and arming weapons systems and running through her pre-engagement checklist with the calm efficiency of someone who'd done it so many times it was muscle memory. Hellfire missiles armed, 30mm cannon ready, targeting systems online. She cycled through her displays, checking threat overlays, scanning for anti-aircraft positions, mapping the enemy column's movement in her head while the Apache hummed around her, responsive and deadly, a machine that felt less like a vehicle and more like an extension of her own intent. On the radio, Command was still debating whether to let her go through with this. A senior major, someone with enough rank to override her decision, was arguing that she should hold back and wait for reinforcements, let the other Apaches catch up before pushing into a fight this lopsided. His concern was clear. Managing both flight and weapons under this kind of pressure, against this many targets, with this much chaos, was overwhelming even for experienced combat pilots. And she was proposing to do it alone, without backup, against a mechanized column that was already less than 10 minutes from overrunning the outpost. Maybe she wasn't ready for this. Maybe this was the moment where confidence crossed into recklessness. Maybe the smart move was to pull her back and let someone with more combat hours take the risk. Raven listened to the debate, let them finish their concerns and contingencies in careful professional language that danced around the real question they were asking. And then she interrupted the frequency with the same calm, professional tone she'd used since the beginning. She would split the column's attention and force them to spread their defensive fire across multiple threat axes. She would suppress their anti-aircraft systems first, the mobile units that posed the biggest threat to her Apache, taking them out before they could coordinate a response that would light her up. Then she would work the column from the flanks, methodical and precise, buying the outpost time by breaking the enemy's momentum and forcing them to slow down, regroup, and reassess their approach. It required Command to trust her, to approve the mission, to let her push in alone against odds that looked suicidal on paper but might be survivable if she executed perfectly. The frequency went quiet for a moment, the kind of silence where everyone is processing the same calculation. Either they sign off and let her fight, or they shut her down and watch the outpost get overrun while waiting for backup that won't arrive in time. Command cleared her hot with a single word that sounded more like resignation than approval, and Raven rolled into the valley with her targeting systems already painting the first threats in glowing overlay across her display. Most pilots would see what Command saw: dozens of tanks, an overwhelming force, a nightmare scenario where the numbers alone were enough to justify retreat. But Raven didn't see it that way, because she trained herself not to think in terms of overwhelming or impossible or too many. She saw distances, angles, missile counts, threat rings, and weak points. She saw a math problem with lives at stake, and math problems have solutions if you're willing to work through them methodically enough. The first priority wasn't the tanks themselves, but the systems designed to kill her before she could touch them. A defense units, mobile AA platforms tucked into the column's protective envelope, scanning the sky for exactly the kind of threat she represented. Command vehicles coordinating the advance, the nerve centers that turned a chaotic mass of armor into an organized assault. Take those out first, and the column loses its eyes, its coordination, its ability to respond effectively to what's about to happen. Let them survive, and they'd light her up the moment she committed to an attack run. Turn her Apache into burning wreckage before she fired her third missile. She used the terrain like a weapon, hugging the ridgelines and staying low enough that the enemy's radar couldn't get a clean lock. The valley had contours, folds in the landscape that let her mask her approach until the last possible second. She'd pop up just long enough to acquire targets, designate them, and send hellfires screaming downrange, then drop back behind cover before the enemy could triangulate her position and return fire. Each engagement lasted seconds, just enough time for her targeting laser to paint a command vehicle or an AA platform, for the missile to launch with that distinctive roar and streak of exhaust, for the impact to blossom into fire and shrapnel that turned armored threats into smoking wreckage. The first AA unit went silent after taking a hellfire through its radar assembly, the explosion bright enough to light up the valley floor for half a second. The second took longer because it was moving, forcing her to lead the shot and compensate for both its velocity and hairs, but the missile found it anyway and turned it into a burning hole that stopped coordinating anything. A command vehicle died next, its comms array collapsing in on itself as the warhead punched through its armor and detonated inside. 3 targets down, 3 missiles gone, and her internal count was already running. 15 hellfires left, enough to make a difference if she spent them wisely. Not enough to kill everything moving down there. The ground troops noticed immediately, their radio chatter shifting from strained panic to something that almost resembled hope. The column's advance had faltered, not stopped but slowed, as the remaining units tried to process what had just hit them and where it came from. For a few seconds, the valley was quieter, the relentless push forward interrupted by confusion and the need to reassess. But Raven knew that window wouldn't last long, because the enemy wasn't incompetent and they weren't going to sit still while she systematically dismantled their formation. She moved to the next phase, shifting her focus to the tanks themselves, prioritizing the ones leading the advance and the ones bottlenecked at natural choke points where the terrain forced them into tighter groupings. A pair of tanks stalled at a narrow pass took hellfires within seconds of each other, the first missile immobilizing the lead vehicle and the second finishing the one trapped behind it. Another tank, advancing too far ahead of its support, died alone when she caught it exposed on open ground with no cover and no time to react. Each kill was precise, calculated, the kind of shooting that comes from knowing your weapon system so well that targeting becomes instinct. But every trigger pull was a trade-off. Every missile launched a resource she'd never get back, and the math was starting to tighten. 12 hellfires left. 11. 10. The column was still moving, still dangerous, and while she'd taken out the most immediate threats and bought the outpost precious minutes, there was still more vehicles down there than she had missiles to kill them with. The enemy was adapting too, spreading out their formation to make targeting harder, moving in shorter bursts with longer pauses, scanning the ridgelines for the Apache that kept appearing and vanishing like a ghost. Then the new threat emerged, and the math got worse. Mobile AA units, the ones she hadn't killed yet, were repositioning deliberately now, moving into positions that would create overlapping fields of fire, a kill box designed to trap her the moment she committed to another attack run. They'd figured out her pattern: pop up, shoot, drop back behind terrain. Now they were setting up to catch her in that vulnerable moment when she rose above the ridgeline, when she'd be exposed for the 2 or 3 seconds it took to acquire and engage a target. Stay predictable and she'd fly straight into a wall of fire that even an Apache couldn't survive. The ground troops were reporting relief, grateful for the breathing room. But Raven could see what they couldn't from their position. The column was still coming, just slower and more cautious, and the AA net was tightening around her operational space. She'd burned through 8 missiles, killed nearly a dozen vehicles, and shifted the momentum enough to buy time. But the fight wasn't over, and the enemy had just made it clear they weren't going to let her keep dictating the terms of engagement. The enemy commander wasn't stupid, and that became obvious the moment the column stopped moving like a blunt instrument and started moving like a scalpel. After watching his lead vehicles and A defense units get shredded by an Apache that kept appearing and vanishing behind terrain, He did what any competent officer would do. He adapted. The column spread wide, breaking its tight formation into dispersed groups that made targeting harder and forced Raven to choose between threats instead of clearing them systematically. Tanks started using the terrain the same way she was, tucking into depressions and behind rocky outcrops, advancing in short bursts that minimized their exposure. And the AA units, the ones she hadn't killed yet, repositioned into overlapping fields of fire that turned large sections of the valley into kill zones she couldn't enter without getting lit up from multiple angles simultaneously. It was a chess match now, two professionals reading each other's moves and adjusting in real time, and the stakes were measured in lives and minutes. Raven could feel the operational space tightening around her, the safe zones where she could pop up and engage shrinking as the AA net closed in. Every pass she made was a calculation. Which ridgeline gave her the angle she needed without exposing her to the guns waiting for exactly that decision? Which targets were worth spending a missile on versus which ones she could suppress with gun runs and hope that bought enough time? Then the ground troops radioed in with Weiss news. Some of the enemy armor had slipped off the main road entirely, pushing along a side wadi that most people wouldn't even call a road, threatening a back gate that the outpost defenders had never seriously fortified because the terrain made it seem impossible. Except it wasn't impossible if you were willing to risk it, and apparently the enemy commander was willing to risk everything now that his frontal assault had stalled. If those tanks reached the back gate, the outpost would be fighting on two fronts with defenders who were already stretched thin, and the whole position would collapse within minutes. Command came back on the radio urging Raven to hold her position, wait for backup that was still 10 minutes out, or climb higher to stay above the AA threat envelope where she'd at least survive long enough for reinforcements to arrive. It was sound advice from a tactical perspective, the kind of call that keeps pilots alive and aircraft operational. But climbing meant giving those AA guns a clean shot at her the moment she rose above the terrain, and it meant allowing the column to close the final distance while she stayed safe at altitude, watching the outpost get overrun from a position where she couldn't do anything to stop it. She didn't climb. She dove lower instead, skimming the valley floor at altitudes that made her rotor wash kick up dust clouds and debris, using buildings and terrain features as cover in ways that most pilots would never risk because the margin for error was measured in feet and the consequences of clipping something were catastrophic. The Apache responded like it always did, nimble and vicious, dancing through terrain at speeds that turned navigation into pure instinct. She wasn't trying to kill every tank in a mall because she didn't have the missiles left to make that math work. Instead, she started targeting mobility, tracks, suspension systems, the bridges and choke points that the column needed to maintain its advance. A tank with a broken track wasn't dead, but it wasn't moving either, and right now stopping the advance mattered more than racking up kill counts. Her Hellfire count dropped to single digits, then ran out completely after she put 2 missiles into a bridge that half the column needed to cross, collapsing it into the wadi below and forcing the tanks behind it to find another route that would cost them precious minutes. She switched to gun runs, the 30mm cannon roaring as she swept over exposed vehicles and raked their thinner top armor with rounds designed to punch through and shred everything inside. Rockets followed, less precise than Hellfires but devastating when she caught clusters of infantry or lighter vehicles grouped too close together. Each pass burned through ammunition she couldn't replace. Each engagement was a trade-off between stopping threats now and having nothing left when the next wave came. The enemy AA was getting closer to solving her pattern, their fire more coordinated now, tracking her movements and predicting where she'd pop up next. She could feel them tightening the noose, see the tracer fire getting nearer with each engagement, hear the change in her warning systems as they went from scanning to tracking to locked. And then, on a pass that took her lower and faster than any before it, an AA burst caught her. Not a direct hit, but close enough that shrapnel tore into the Apache's tail section and sent alarms screaming through the cockpit in overlapping cascades of warning tones and flashing indicators. The aircraft shuddered, its handling going loose in a way that meant something structural had taken damage, and Raven's training kicked in with the same cold efficiency she'd used for everything else tonight. Damage assessment, systems check, flight controls still responsive but degraded, hydraulics bleeding pressure from somewhere she couldn't see, fuel consumption spiking as the engines compensated for the drag. The math was brutal. She could bug out now, climb to safety, nurse the wounded Apache back to friendly airspace, and live to fight another day with an aircraft that might still be repairable. Or she could push deeper into the trap, ignore the alarms and the damage and the fact that her aircraft was bleeding performance with every second, and try to stop the last wave of tanks heading for the outpost back gate before they reached a position where nothing could save the defenders. Command was calling her, voices tight with concern, telling her to break off and egress while she still could. The ground troops were calling too, their words harder to make out now through the static and chaos, but the desperation was clear. And the enemy AA units were repositioning again, reading her damaged flight profile, calculating the intercept for an Apache that couldn't maneuver the way it used to, setting up for the kill shot that would end this decisively. Raven's hands were steady on the controls despite the shaking A-frame and the alarms that wouldn't stop screaming. She had maybe 3 minutes of effective combat capability left before the damage degraded past the point where she could keep fighting, maybe less if another burst found her. No missiles, limited gun ammunition, an aircraft that was holding together through will and engineering redundancy, but wouldn't survive another hit, and a clear line of sight to the tanks pushing toward the back gate, the ones that would end this fight if she let them through. Raven made the decision in the half-second between hearing Command tell her to break off and watching the enemy tanks continue their push toward the outpost back gate, and once she made it there was no hesitation, no second-guessing, just the cold acceptance that she was about to fly through the heaviest AA coverage in the valley with an aircraft that was already bleeding performance and ammunition stores that wouldn't last another 3 minutes of sustained combat. She checked her remaining weapons with the detached efficiency of someone reading a grocery list. A handful of rockets, maybe 200 rounds of 30mm, and an A-frame that shuddered every time she pushed it through a hard maneuver. The math said she should leave, preserve the aircraft, let someone else handle the problem. But the math also said the outpost would be overrun in less than 5 minutes if those tanks reached the back gate, and 5 minutes was longer than it would take for her to spend everything she had left. So she stopped trying to survive the fight and started trying to win it, which meant accepting that some of these passes might be her last and flying them anyway. She wasn't trying to kill every vehicle anymore because she didn't have the ammunition for that fantasy. She was trying to break the columns will, shatter their coordination, make them believe that staying in this valley meant dying in it. She coordinated with the ground troops, timing her attacks to coincide with their mortar fire, calling out targets and guiding their rounds onto choke points she'd already softened with gun runs. The collaboration turned the fight from a one-sided slaughter into something that felt like synchronized chaos. Her Apache screaming through the kill zone while mortar rounds walked across the enemy's flanks, explosions blooming in sequence, fire and smoke creating the illusion of overwhelming force where there was really just desperation and perfect timing. She hit the lead tanks first, not to destroy them but to block the route, turning them into burning obstacles that forced everything behind them to slow down or find another path. Her rockets punched into tracks and suspension systems, immobilizing vehicles that became targets for the mortars already inbound. She hammered the flanks next, raking the thinner side armor with 30mm rounds that sparked and tore and made drivers panic, made them wonder if staying buttoned up in a steel coffin was really safer than bailing out and running. Every pass took her deeper into the AA envelope, closer to the guns that were tracking her with increasing accuracy, and every pass meant ignoring alarms that screamed about hydraulic pressure and engine temperature and damage she couldn't fix mid-flight. Her ammo counter dropped toward zero faster than the enemy's will to fight, and that became the new race. Could she create enough chaos, enough fear, enough burning wreckage before she ran out of ways to hurt them? She kept making aggressive low passes even as her weapons dwindled, kicking up dust clouds with her rotor wash, popping flares that lit up the night like fireworks, jinking and weaving as if she was still dodging incoming fire from a fully armed and operational aircraft instead of nursing a damaged Apache that was one good hit away from falling out of the sky. The enemy didn't know she was running on fumes. They just knew that every time they tried to advance, that same Apache appeared out of nowhere and something exploded. Then her weapons went dry, the ammunition counter hitting zero with a finality that most pilots would treat as a signal to egress immediately, and she heard herself call Winchester over the radio, The brevity code that meant she'd expended all ordnance and had nothing left to fight with except the airframe itself. Some enemy armor still existed, still moved, still threatened the outpost despite everything she'd thrown at them. Command was already calling her back, telling her she'd done enough, ordering her to break contact and return to base before the AA finally got lucky. But Raven didn't turn away. She kept flying straight at them instead, diving toward the remaining tanks with the same aggressive profile she'd used when she still had missiles and rockets and a gun that could tear them apart. She jinked hard, threw out flays, flew like she was lining up for another attack run, made every movement scream threat and danger and imminent violence even though her weapons pylons were empty and her gun was silent. It was pure psychological warfare now, presence and angles and the weight of everything she'd already done to them, betting that the enemy's nerve would break before they realized she was bluffing. The bet paid off. The remaining tanks hesitated, then stopped, then began backing up as their crews processed the burning wrecks scattered across the valley, the mortar fire still falling, the Apache that refused to leave despite taking damage and expending everything it should have had. One tank turned first, its commander apparently deciding that survival mattered more than the objective, and that single decision cascaded through the column like a virus. More tanks turned. The advance stalled completely. And then, finally, the entire formation began withdrawing, pulling back from the valley in a retreat that wasn't organized or tactical, but pure self-preservation instinct taking over. Raven's voice came over the radio, exhausted and rough in a way it hadn't been all night, confirming what the ground troops could already see. The column was falling back. The pressure was lifting. The outpost was going to survive. The ground troops erupted in overlapping shouts of relief and disbelief, voices cracking with emotion as they realized they weren't going to die tonight after all. And on the command frequency, there was just silence, the kind of silence that happens when people witness something they didn't think was possible and need a moment to process what they just watched someone accomplish alone. The debrief room felt wrong after the valley. Too quiet, too bright, the fluorescent lights humming in that flat institutional way that made everything feel sterile and disconnected from the chaos that had unfolded just hours earlier. Raven sat at the back, still in her flight suit, hair damp with sweat that had dried and then returned as she'd wrestled a damaged Apache back to base on failing hydraulics and prayers. The room was full of people who hadn't been there, who'd watched the engagement unfold on screens and data feeds, and now they were arguing over the numbers projected on the wall like they were debating a budget report instead of a night where people almost died. The numbers were stark enough to make anyone pause. Dozens of enemy tanks and armored vehicles destroyed or disabled. An entire mechanized column turned back from an objective they'd been rolling toward with overwhelming force, zero friendly KIA at the outpost that had been minutes from being overrun, and one Apache that had limped home so badly damaged that the maintenance chief had walked around it twice just shaking his head at what the A-frame had absorbed and somehow kept flying through. The data said it was a victory, a decisive one, but the room was still arguing about what kind of victory it was and whether the cost could have been justified if things had gone differently. The same major who'd questioned whether she could handle the mission earlier was trying to frame it as reckless, his words careful and professional, but carrying the unmistakable subtext that luck had played as much of a role as skill, that the outcome didn't validate the risk, that letting a single pilot push into those conditions had been a gamble that happened to pay off this time, but could easily have ended in a different room having a very different conversation about a pilot who didn't make it back. He wasn't cruel about it, wasn't dismissive, but the doubt was still there, wrapped in concern about setting precedents and maintaining standards and not encouraging solo heroics that might get someone killed next time. Other pilots pushed back immediately, breaking down the engagement with the kind of technical precision that only people who'd flown the same aircraft and faced similar situations could bring to the discussion. They walked through her target priority decisions, how she'd identified and eliminated the AA threats first instead of going after the flashier tank kills, how she'd used terrain masking in ways that were textbook perfect but executed under conditions that made textbook tactics nearly impossible. Ground commanders joined in, explaining how her coordination with their mortar teams had turned a desperate last stand into something that actually resembled a combined arms operation, how her timing had been so precise that the limited fire support had multiplied its effectiveness beyond what the numbers should have allowed. Then the screen flickered and a senior colonel appeared via secure video link, his rank and reputation enough to quiet the room immediately. And he asked to hear the story in Raven's own words, not the sanitized after-action report or the data analysis, but her thinking, her decisions, what she saw that made her believe she could turn the situation around when everyone else was preparing for evacuation overrun. She walked him through it methodically, not defensively but with the same calm precision she'd used in the cockpit, explaining how she'd broken the problem down into solvable pieces, how each decision had been a calculated trade-off between risk and necessity, how running out of ammunition hadn't meant running out of options because the enemy didn't know she was empty and their perception of threat mattered as much as the actual threat she posed. As she spoke, you could see the shift happening in the room. The way people who'd been skeptical started leaning forward, started asking questions that weren't challenges but genuine curiosity about how she'd managed specific aspects of the engagement. Even the major who'd called it reckless went quiet, his expression shifting from concern to something that looked like reluctant respect, the kind of respect that comes from realizing you'd misjudged someone badly and were watching them prove it in real time without ever making you feel small for having doubted them. By the time she finished, the room wasn't debating whether the mission had been justified anymore. They were trying to figure out how to capture what she'd done so it could be taught, studied, turned into something other pilots could learn from. Months later, the engagement showed up in new training modules and doctrine slides, dissected and analyzed and turned into a case study for asymmetric attack helicopter tactics under overwhelming enemy pressure. Her call sign became shorthand in the community for refusing to accept impossible when lives were at stake, for the kind of preparation that turns desperate situations into survivable ones, for the difference between competence and mastery when everything is falling apart and you're the only thing standing between survival and catastrophe. The training scenarios didn't focus on gender or representation or breaking barriers. They focused on her decisions, her target priority, her use of terrain, her ability to turn psychological pressure into a weapon when kinetic options ran dry. The same system that had once questioned whether she could handle the Apache now taught new pilots to study her engagement frame by frame. Not because she was a woman who pulled off a miracle and needed to be celebrated for symbolic reasons, but because she'd shown what real mastery looks like under conditions that would have broken lesser pilots regardless of who they were or where they came from. She'd proven that warriors aren't defined by other people's expectations or doubts or whispered concerns about whether they belong in the cockpit. They're defined by what they do when the radio is screaming and the alarms won't stop and the math says you should retreat, but the ground troops are counting on you to stay. She'd flown into a situation that looked like suicide on paper and turned it into a case study. And somewhere in a ready room right now, the new pilot was learning her name and studying her decisions and realizing that impossible is just another word for hasn't been done yet by someone prepared enough to try.